In the last video we met the neuron and the synapse, and we looked at some of the emerging ideas about how neurons and synapses might be able to store memories, and I alluded to the theoretical ideas that started to come along, suggesting that it might be possible to use synapses in a network, in a cell assembly or something, to store memory. And so what I want to do in this lecture is to walk you through some of those ideas. So the problem is, how do you store a memory that is content addressable? So in other words, when you're presented with some type of retrieval cue, the system knows exactly where in the brain that memory is stored. And how would you do that with neurons? So in the 1940s, researchers started to create artificial neurons to try and answer this question. So motivated by the properties that were being discovered in real neurons, and the emerging technologies that were being developed in electrical engineering, so computers were coming along at this point. And so the question was, is the brain somewhat like a computing device? So two engineers, McCulloch and Pitts, got together to try and simulate a neuron. And so what they did was they created this very idealized neuron, which had the properties that seemed to be relevant in real neurons, namely that they can collect a bunch of inputs, add them all up, and then maybe or maybe not produce an output. So the McCulloch-Pitts neuron is an idealized neuron, so you can see it has inputs coming in, some kind of central processor, and then an output. The inputs we refer to as A for activation, and the amount of activation is modulated by the strength of the connection of that input, which we call a weight, W. So you can have a strong activation, but if there's only a very small connection, a small weight, it's not going to have a big effect on the neuron. So what comes into the neuron is a combination of how strong the activation was and how large the weight was. So in the McCulloch-Pitts neuron, what the central processor does is it adds up the activation times the weight of each of its inputs and decides whether or not the sum total exceeds a threshold. And if it does, the neuron will fire, and if it doesn't, then it won't fire. So McCulloch and Pitts showed that with a neuron following this kind of activation rule, you can create certain kinds of logical operation. For example, this is an example of a logical AND. A logical AND means that an output will be produced if there is a confluence of inputs of the right size. So if the sum of them adds up to more than the threshold. So remember that the activation is multiplied by the weight. So in this particular example, you've got each activation is 1 and its weight is 1. So you've got 1 times 1 plus 1 times 1 is 2. And the threshold for that neuron, which is shown on the right there, is 3. So the sum of those activations times their weights is doesn't exceed the threshold, and so in that case the neuron won't fire. On the other hand, if the third input was also active, now the sum of all of the activations times the weights would be 3, and the neuron would fire. So with a logical AND, and by modulating the threshold and the weights, you can decide under what conditions that neuron will or won't fire. Here's an example of a logical OR. So it's a similar principle. You've got the activation times the weight, and in the top example, the active input is 1 and the weight is 1. So you've got 1 times 1, but none of the other inputs are active, so there's no more to add to that. So the sum total is 1 and the threshold is 1, and so the cell will fire. And the second neuron, the first input isn't active anymore, but the second one is. So the sum of all of those inputs is still 1, and that still exceeds the threshold, so the neuron will still fire. So this is a neuron that will fire when input 1 is active, or if input 2 is active, so it's a logical OR. So McCulloch-Pitts neurons provide a way of doing simple logical operations, and so the idea is if you connect a whole bunch of these together, you might be able to get more complicated things going on. But that doesn't tell you about memory. That just tells you about computation. So the question is, how could you store memory in a network of neurons? And in the 1940s, people were starting to think about the possibility that synapses were where this happens. So Cahal and others had proposed that synapses might be modifiable in strength. And then Hebb, who we've met previously because he developed this cell assembly idea, he proposed that the synapses could provide a potential memory mechanism by virtue of quite a simple rule. So his idea was basically that you can create a cell assembly by creating connections between neurons that are synchronously active. So you remember with the cell assembly that it's a set of synchronously active neurons whose collective activity means activation of some type of concept. So the question then is, how do you build up these cell assemblies? How do you create, for example, a new concept? So Hebb proposed a way that you could do this. So he proposed a rule for the formation of connections, which says that if you've got two neurons that are connected together and they're synchronously active, then you should strengthen that connection. And he formalized it in the Hebb rule. When an axon of cell A is near enough to excite a cell B and repeatedly and persistently takes part in firing it, some growth process or metabolic change takes place in one or both cells such that A's efficacy as one of the cells firing B is increased. So it's pretty wordy and not that easy to remember. But the basic idea is that if you've got A connected to B, and whenever B is active, A is also active. So it sort of seems likely that A was helping to drive B, and therefore they're part of the same cell assembly, and the connection between them should be strengthened. So that's the basic idea. So you've got cell A and cell B and cell C. So let's say that cell A and cell B are synchronously active, then you should strengthen that connection between cell A and cell B. Now cell C and cell B were never synchronously active, so you shouldn't strengthen that connection. That's the basic idea. It is quite hard to remember, so we've kind of shortened it now. So it's kind of a mnemonic. Cells that fire together wire together. And then the converse of that, cells that are out of sync fail to link. So cell C and cell B should be disconnected. Their weight, the connection between them, should actually be weakened because they're clearly not really meant to be part of the same cell assembly. So this is the Hebb rule. It's incredibly simple. But when you combine the Hebb rule with networks made of McCulloch-Pitts neurons, you can get some really powerful types of computation going. So you can see how the Hebb rule, for example, supports associative learning. So with Pavlov's dog, for example, you have the conditioned stimulus, so the signal for food is coming in as one of the inputs, and it's kind of being paired with the dog's representation of food in its mind, and when these things are repeatedly associated, eventually activation of the food will be so strongly connected to the dog's mind that it'll make it think of the food. That's kind of essentially how you can think of it. So Hebbian synapses have two important properties. One is that the synapses are modifiable in strength. So it's a step beyond the McCulloch-Pitts neuron. Not only have you got these weights, but these weights can be changed. And we now have a rule for changing them. We don't have to do this by hand to kind of twiddle with the network to get it to work. The network can learn for itself what are the ideal weights. And the other important thing about the rule is the co-activation rule, the fact that the synchronous activity is the trigger for the change in strength. So there's another rule that's turned out to be incredibly important in neural computation, and that is prediction error. And this was something that began to sort of emerge in the 60s. And the idea is trying to solve the problem of how to correctly wire up these networks. So you can have something like the Hebb rule, but it might create spurious associations, like two things get accidentally associated together. The connection between them strengthens. That means that they're more likely to be active in the future, so the connection will get stronger still, and so on. And you end up with this positive feedback loop where you get these erroneous cell assemblies forming. So the prediction error idea suggests that networks can learn to achieve the correct wiring on the basis of the feedback that they get about whether the association was the correct one or not. So this idea of having feedback that tells you whether or not you should change the strength of your connection, it kind of popped up several times, more or less simultaneously, in the middle of last century. So there are variants of this rule. One of them is the Delta rule, one of them is the Woodrow-Hoff rule, and one of them is the Rescorla-Wagner rule. But they all basically have the same fundamental principle. They say that basically that the amount of learning on a given trial, so for a McCulloch-Pitts network, that would be how much do you change the weights, or for a psychologist doing a conditioning paradigm, it would be how much does the response increase. Depends on the difference between what was expected and what actually happened, so a prediction error. So the Rescorla-Wagner rule, just to take an example of this, this is the Rescorla-Wagner rule in its kind of formal state. And what it says is that the associative strength to the conditioned stimulus, in other words, how much does the rattling of the bowl make the dog think of food, or something like that, is a product of some constant, which is just something that regulates how quickly these changes happen, so the learning rate parameter, times the difference between the maximum associative strength that the UCS can support. So what's the strongest expectation that a dog can have that food is about to arrive? And the current total amount of strength for all the stimuli present. So let's say the dog is halfway through learning to associate the rattling of the bowl with food. The maximum that it can expect the food is if food was actually present. That's the most it could be thinking about food when food is actually there. And the bowl makes it think a little bit about food. So the bowl rattles, the dog thinks a little bit about food, and food appears. So there's a big difference between the food actually appearing and the small amount of expectation that the dog had. So that's the trigger to increase the strength of the connection between the food and the expectation of the dog. So the prediction error was quite large at that point. And then the training goes on, and the bowl is rattled more and more, and every time that happens, the expectation of the dog increases, and eventually the association is so strong that when the bowl is rattled, the dog immediately thinks, food, and sure enough, food appears. So you've got a maximum association. There's now no prediction error, so the dog thought about food strongly when the bowl was rattled and food appeared, so there's no prediction error, so there's no further need to change any of the strengths of the connections. That network has now learned the association. So that's a toy example, but that's the basic idea behind prediction error, and it's turned out to be incredibly important and powerful. So this idea that you're trying to minimize error has a sort of a realization in modern neural networks, so deep learning networks, which I'll mention in a moment. So this is just a schematic showing you that it's summarizing a whole bunch of different models, but the basic idea, it's just a schematic of what I've just talked you through, this idea that you have a prediction, you update the prediction based on some type of error signal, and then you apply the results of your update. So the tricky thing for biologists has been to figure out how to get this information back. So if you've got a synapse buried deep in the brain, let's say the one that's got the engram for the association between the bowl and the food or something like that, and then there's been some type of error, the dog didn't have a sufficiently high expectation for food, how do you feed that back to the actual neuron? So that's a problem we still haven't solved in biology, but we've solved it in theoretical neuroscience by just hand wiring these networks, so propagating the error back. So in other words, if you have a whole bunch of neurons connected together in layers, so sets of neurons, successive hierarchy of connections, and some type of error happens at the output, you tell the neurons that were just before the output that something went wrong, and so they adjust their connections, and then that feeds back to the layer before, and they adjust their connections and so on, and it back propagates all the way back. So backprop is the algorithm by which modern deep networks work, and that's how all of these machine learning things that can do really amazing things like face recognition, that's how all of that works in an artificial neural network. The question for us as biologists is how might that work in the real brain, and we haven't solved that one yet.